Hello friends, welcome to today's class. Today we'll be dealing with a topic which is of vital importance in our field, that is ethics. Ethics in the field of experimental psychology. Ethics can be seen as a branch of philosophy which is basically concerned with recommending and systematizing and telling us what is right and what is wrong and what is moral conduct. Now, in most behavioral sciences, unlike physical sciences, we deal with living organisms. In many physical sciences, we deal with inanimate objects. But in subjects such as psychology or sociology or education, we deal with human beings and other living organisms. Now, this brings in the big question of ethics, because no doubt research in psychology is important, but we should always keep in mind that at what cost the research is being conducted. The cost at which the research is being conducted should never exceed the benefits of the research. Now, the experimental psychologist faces a big dilemma, because on one hand he has to deal with the complex problems of research, how to exercise experimental control, how to exercise reliability, validity and the like. And on the other hand, he has to face this big problem of ethics in dealing with human beings and animals. As we know, psychology is not just a science of human beings, but it is also a science which deals with the behavior of animals. So to make the task of the experimental researcher easy, certain organizations have put forward codes of ethics. Now, which are these organizations? These are the American Psychological Association, the British Psychological Association, the United States Office of Education, and the American Society for Prevention of Cruelty to Animals. Now, these societies have put forward a code of moral conduct which can actually guide the experimental researcher, and it is mandatory that he follows these ethics. He cannot claim ignorance because the ethics are clear, and in any case, he has to follow them at all costs. Now, psychological research, as we know, greatly advances our knowledge about human behavior, and since it leads to such an important advancement of knowledge, no doubt it is very useful to human beings. But again, as I said, psychological research should in no way exceed the limits or violate the limits of human rights, because human rights are most important than any other research. Of course, human beings should volunteer, should consent to participate in experimental research, especially with regard to psychology. But of course, human rights must be our priority as researchers. Now, Berg in 1954, who was a very influential researcher in this field, put forward three concepts with regard to ethics. One is consent, the other is confidence, and the third is standard procedure. I repeat again, consent, confidence and standard procedure. First, we'll go to consent. Any psychological research to begin with requires that a written consent be obtained from all the prospective subjects. Now, this is not simply a consent, it is an informed consent. When I say it is an informed consent, it means that the subjects should have full information of what will happen to them in the experimental research, especially with regard to the possibility of pain, risk, hurt, any of these feelings either on the physical or emotional level. And knowing that this can possibly happen, they should give their informed consent. Only when they give their consent with full knowledge can it be treated as valid and can we take those subjects for the experiment. Now, say if a person is mentally disturbed, which may be a case in our field, how do we take him for research? Because possibly he cannot give a proper informed consent. So in that case, either his physician or doctor or his guardians, caregivers or parents or both should give informed consent. Only then can you go ahead with the experiment. Now that we have dealt with the foremost aspect of consent, we go into the next aspect of confidence. Now, what is confidence? Before the research starts or before the subjects register for the research, they should have full confidence in the experimenter. confidence that the attitudes, views, beliefs or habits or whatever information they provide in the research will be kept confidential and will not be used for any other purposes, will not be misused in fact. Now, if they have that degree of confidence in the experimenter, only then are they allowed to go ahead with research. Now, the experimenter can do a lot of things to increase the subject's confidence in him. He can explain to them why the research is important. He can tell them what are the procedures involved in the research, what are the different possibilities of the research, what will happen to them. And he can also assure them that the results will not be misused in any way and their privacy will be maintained. Now we have gone over two basic aspects of ethical research. One is to obtain an informed consent from the subjects, and the second is to ensure that the subjects have full confidence in the experiment. Consent is the first step, confidence is a necessary step. Now we come to the third step that Burke put forward. Now this involves standard procedure. Now what do we mean by standard procedure? Or when can a researcher say that the experiment I am conducting uses standard procedure? Basically, standard procedure means experimental procedure that has been tried and tested before. Probably the investigator has conducted the research either on himself or on his associates, or at least gone over the process of research a number of times or replicated it in a kind of preparatory study. But then this condition does not hold true in all situations, because in some situations the stimulus or the research in itself may be so novel and original that if you actually simulate it before the experiment, the entire purpose of the experiment goes wrong. So you actually cannot fulfill the entire criteria of standard procedure. So how do we go ahead? Because this is the case in many of the researches in psychology. So in such cases, the researcher must ensure that the experiment and its experimental procedure has at least been seen or deemed or ratified as standard by other experts or by other people or by other standard practitioners of the field. And all these people who ratify these procedures must put forward or must emphasize and declare that the procedures are suitable for the welfare of the human subjects or the animal subjects, and that the costs of the research do not exceed its benefits. Now, there are some rules in standard procedure which must be followed, and we are going to discuss these rules in detail. The first is the possibility of injurious after effects. Whenever the experiment brings forward a possibility of injurious after effects, now be sure that this can be either physical injury or emotional injury or mental injury, any of that kind. Whenever a possibility exists of any such kind of injurious after effect, the researcher must inform the subject. It is obligatory that he informs the subject in detail as to what are the possible injurious after effects, what will be the possible injury or the possible costs that he will be paying once he participates in the experiment. The second and the most important condition is that whenever the design of the experiment includes any kind of drug treatments or medical procedures, for instance, you may want to see how people behave under the influence of certain drugs or how people behave when they are intoxicated. In all such circumstances where any form of drugs are used, the entire procedure should be conducted with the guidance and under the supervision of a qualified physician. And the physician should be present not only during the experiment but as long as is necessary for the subject, because many times the after effects will come after the experiment has gotten over. A third most important condition is privacy, because we as human beings of course like to maintain our privacy. None of us would want all our views, attitudes, beliefs, habits or our personal private experiences and life to be open to others, unless we wish to do so or unless they are people we want to share them with. Now, in an experiment, many a time the person may be asked to share his private information. And this information may include many personal questions. For instance, certain personal habits or for example, sexual preferences and so on. and so the person has the full right to ensure that this information remains private. Now, what can the experimenter do in this situation? Because many a times in psychological experiments, we give the person behavioral questionnaires, and through the questionnaires, he has to answer questions which give out a lot of information about what he feels. And if he feels that his privacy is being violated, he may actually withhold the information and he may not actually answer the questions properly. So the researcher has two important functions. The first is to ensure that no unnecessary or embarrassing personal questions are asked during the period of the experiment. Nothing unnecessary, unless it is very required for the experiment. And point number two, the experimenter has to put forward what can be said as a human resource function. He should actually instill confidence in the person. He should explain to the person how the information will be treated, that no one except him or those who require the information urgently for the experimental study will know about the information. Secondly, it will only be used for drawing certain conclusions which are necessary. It will not be made public, and that confidentiality will be maintained at all costs. Another major ethical rule is that the researcher should respect the right of the subject to maintain anonymity or to remain anonymous. And to maintain this anonymity, often personal identities are concealed when the experimental results are used. For instance, the names of the people will not be used. They will only be using some kind of labels or false names or numbers to put forward case studies or any other kind of experimental data. And we should also remember that what we need in the experiment is not the personal identity but the data, and hence all efforts should be made to ensure that this condition of anonymity is not violated. And all the data that is obtained from the subject should be treated confidentially. Often in the experimental research, we may use recordings, either audio recordings or video recordings, or there may be some kind of written records of the entire experiment that has taken place. Of course, if you are engaging in any kind of written records or audio or video recording, it is necessary to take a prior consent from the subject before engaging in it. Secondly, the data should be stored very confidentially so that no one who is in not any way associated with the experiment gets his hand on it. It should not be made public in any way. And once the test process is over, or once the data has been used and all the work relating to the data has been completed, all this data and test protocols must be destroyed, and no such evidence which reveals personal identities should remain. Now we come to another major consideration in standard procedure, and this is deception. Now you will be surprised to know that ethics say that psychologists should use deception whenever possible. Now how ethical is this? This question is still being debated. Now the reality is that it becomes necessary to use deception at times in psychological experiments because revealing all aspects of the experiment to the subject will actually destroy the purpose of the experiment. For example, let us take this case. There is a famous research in social psychology wherein they put the participants or the subjects into two rooms, and they were just asked to fill in certain forms before entering into the research procedure. But actually this research was conducted to see the effect of how people will behave when they are alone or when there are other people with them. So when the subjects were actually preparing to go into the experiment had already started. One group of subjects was with certain accomplices of the experimenter in one room, and in another room there was a single subject, and then they put smoke into the room to see how the single subject or the subject who is in the company of others will react. So you see how deception has to be used in such situations, because if you were going to reveal entire context to the subject, then the experiment would be over even before it began. But again, there are ethical considerations. How ethical is it to actually deceive the subject and conduct the experiment without telling him what the purpose is or what he is going to experience? That is why the Code of Ethics puts forward that even while using deception, certain things should be kept in mind. Firstly, if there is any possibility of injury, harm, or anything that has any serious consequences, then of course information should be provided to the subject. Deception cannot be used. Secondly, as much as information possible about the main purpose of the experiment or some major procedures should be given to the subject, so that at least they have some idea while going into the experiment. And the most important point in deception is debriefing. Now, debriefing happens once the experiment is over. And if you use deception, it is mandatory that you also engage in debriefing. Now, what is debriefing? Debriefing is explaining to the subjects the entire process of the experiment, what they underwent, what was the purpose of the experiment, what was being tested, what was the meaning of the procedures involved. But all this after the experiment is over. Once the experiment is over, it becomes both necessary and useful for the psychologists to actually explain to the subjects that fine, we kept away some information from you, we withheld some information, but this was the reason why we withheld it, and this was the experiment you underwent, and these were the behaviors we were studying, and this was the way we did it. So the result is that the subject, of course, feels good. He doesn't feel that he has been totally deceived or totally cheated, or he doesn't know why he came here and what he did and what was the purpose of it. So he at least has a feeling of satisfaction like he had before he entered the experimental situation. Of course, even though we say that debriefing actually reduces the adverse effects of deception, it can raise another big issue. For instance, when you debrief and the participant knows that he has been deceived, he will always have this feeling inside him that fine, in an experimental situation I may be deceived, and this may carry on to further situations. And he will also feel suspicious and a bit apprehensive of the situation of the psychological experiment and the psychologist himself as to, yes, if he is calling me for an experiment, whether or not there is deception, he will always feel that yes, I am being deceived in some way, and the procedures which I am undergoing mean something else. So probably he will attach a lot of meaning than is necessary in other situations involving psychological experiments. Now, as I said in the beginning, psychology is not just a study of human behavior, it is also essentially a study of animal behavior. And if we see, most of our pioneering and most influential researches and conclusions have been drawn from our experiments on animals. And we as psychologists and psychology as a field owes a lot to animals and their contribution to research. For instance, from the earliest times, you look at Pavlov's dog. If Pavlov's dog wasn't there, we wouldn't have learned about classical conditioning. Imagine not having Skinner's pigeons and rats. How would we know about operant conditioning? Similarly, Kohler's Sultan and his entire legion of chimpanzees, in fact, how would we have known about insight? Similarly, Thorndike's cat, who taught us about trial and error. In fact, animals have contributed such a lot to psychological research, primarily because the research which was being conducted could not have been ethically conducted on human beings. For instance, lesions, surgical procedures and the like. You cannot put all that on human beings because it would be totally unethical. Secondly, the reproductive processes of animals and their growth processes are far faster as compared to human beings. So when you are comparing generations and when you are comparing longitudinal growth and development, then of course it becomes easier and most practical to use animals. So as I said, animals are one of the strongest foundations of psychological research. In fact, psychologists have specially recognized the role of especially the white albino rat for all that it contributed to psychological research and for the innumerable experiments in which the rat was the subject. So when we are using animals in research, does it mean that we do not have to use any ethical considerations? No. Animals also require as much ethical consideration as we use when we are dealing with human beings. And hence we know that there is the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, which has again put forward, along with the APA and other associations, a very comprehensive code of ethics of which we are required to follow whenever we are using animals as subjects in an experiment. Now, what are these codes of ethics? For example, the first one, all animals in the experiment need to be lawfully possessed. You should have a license for all the animals you are using in the experiment. You cannot just pick up any animal from anywhere and then put it into an experiment. This is because there should be some kind of accountability that yes, these are the animals being used and this is the way in which they should be treated. If you are using unlawfully or if there is no registration, no one will know how many animals are being used and how they are being treated. Secondly, every effort should be made to avoid any kind of bodily discomfort to the animal. You should make sure that the animals are properly fed, their nutritional needs are taken care of, they are safeguarded, they have a proper home, they have a proper shelter, they are given proper facilities, sanitation and so on. So every effort should be made to ensure that they have the highest degree of comfort. Thirdly, animals should be kept in a kind and empathetic environment. You know, animals are not like human beings. They cannot express their feelings to us. Probably they will be tired during the course of an experiment. Of course, if you are a human subject, you can say that, yes, I am tired. Shall we stop the experiment? Animals cannot say so. They may actually show aggression or irritation. It is in these circumstances that kindness, understanding and empathy should be used. Animals should not be punished or treated cruelly in any way. Many times, surgical operations may be conducted on animals to fulfill the purpose of research. For instance, in lesion studies, you actually destroy or anesthetize certain parts of the brain and see their effect in animals. So or you place electrodes. In all such kinds of surgical procedures, it becomes mandatory to do such procedures under proper anesthesia, and secondly, to ensure that a qualified veterinary surgeon or a veterinary doctor is present throughout the procedure and it is under his guidance and supervision that the procedure is carried out. Also, it is not just about the surgical procedure. Animals should also be given complete post-operative care in a humane manner. Moreover, the work hours of the animals, how much time is the animal being subjected to the experiment, what kind of treatment is it receiving, are all things which fall within the purview of ethical considerations with regard to animals. Now, in this lesson, we have seen that certain organizations which are considered foremost in our discipline have put forward code of ethics both for the use of human beings as also for the use of animals in an experimental situation. Efforts are being made to recognize the importance of developing code of ethics, not only a common code of ethics, but also code of ethics in different countries. For instance, India and other Asian or African or European countries with appropriate cultural considerations so that ethics take care of all the small procedures and all the small considerations and processes which are particular to a specific geographical situation. Now, what we must keep in mind is that following ethics and proper ethical procedure is mandatory on your part as a psychological experimenter. And since code of ethics has been clearly laid out, you cannot claim ignorance. You cannot say that I did not know that such a code existed and that is why I used such procedures which are seen as unethical. So, every researcher has to have full knowledge and has to apply the knowledge fully. And any lapse in this regard can actually attract punishment from a court of law. So, we know how important ethics are both from the perspective of our own moral conduct, our own moral responsibility in conducting the experiment, as also for the fact that they are legally enforced.